Welcome to In Pursuit of Darkness, a detective's journey that reveals the terrifying depths of human darkness and violence through the lens of Michigan's most prolific and successful violent crime investigator. I'm your host, Michael Minzey, and together with my father, David Minzey, we recount the investigation of Michigan's most terrifying and violent crimes. Involved in over 10,000 violent crime investigations, he is a retired Michigan State Police detective, former manager of the Michigan State Police Violent Crimes Unit, and an expert criminal profiler. His relentless pursuit of justice brought him face to face with some of the most heinous killers, rapists, and violent offenders. These are his stories in pursuit of darkness. In today's episode, rather than focusing on a specific case, we will be discussing one of the darkest elements of his career, the sexualization and victimization of children. More specifically, we will be discussing my father's experience with disturbed individuals who fantasize and prey upon our most precious, innocent, and vulnerable. Thanks for joining us again today, Dad.
Well, thank you for having me.
So we're going to cover kind of a large breadth of this area, and I'd like to first start off with defining pedophilia and maybe correct for our audience what that really means when it comes to criminal investigation and law enforcement.
Sure. Pedophilia basically comes from the Greek words of child and friendly to a child. It doesn't really identify what we now know in terms of pedophilia, but that's the origin of the term.
Okay, and when we talk about how that applies in today's world, what do we mean when we say pedophile? Should we be using that word? Is that the appropriate kind of language?
Yes, it is. In some cases, in others, it isn't. Pedophile really means prepubescent children. Hebephile means postpubescent. So the dividing line I found happens to be puberty, body hair. Individuals who do molest children tend to either go with a child who has no body hair, hasn't reached puberty, and those who have.
And we talk about these kinds of individuals. Are we talking about adults typically? I think, is that how we differentiate that?
Well, the largest category happens to be adults, and primarily they tend to be males.
But not exclusively.
That's correct. There are women out there that we know sexually molest children, and we have some teenagers who also sexually molest those, primarily in the prepubescent era.
So in your career, did you have a large number of cases that you would say fit this category of investigation?
Yeah, initially when I became the profiler, the vast majority of the cases that I worked on involved pedophilia. And it tied into, at the time, what was referred to as the satanic panic. That overnight it seemed that there were a number of people who claimed that they had been molested, and in many cases that they bore a child, and that child was then sacrificed on a satanic altar. And my point at that time was, instead of just labeling these cases and calling it for what it is, let's actually investigate them and find out if in fact they were true.
And
we weren't able to verify any one of them. Now, we did find a number of cases that we had a pedophile, but there was no connection to the satanic aspect. And in terms of law enforcement's involvement, whether it had to do with, Satanism or whether it had to do with somebody who clearly was a pedophile, it didn't really matter to the police. We represent the victim.
Right. So as a criminal profiler and having a large number of these cases under your belt, are there any patterns or themes that you found amongst these individuals?
Quite often there was a connection to the victim. It could be a priest, it could be a coach, could be an uncle, for example. And quite often they began by basically a flirtation of sort, befriending the child, giving them gifts, kind of luring them in. And we were able to take a look at that, and we found it to be rather standard across the board.
I've heard the term grooming thrown around quite a bit. Would you say that is an accurate term, or how does that kind of fit into this?
Oh, I think that's an excellent term. I think that better applies to the role that pedophiles play as they, of course, bring these children and groom them.
So, what are some maybe common misnomers that you have experienced? Do you feel that the social view of these individuals is accurate, or is there anything that maybe is misunderstood?
Well, when you're talking about crimes against children, that, of course, is going to be a hot button across the board. And many of the cases came out of daycare facilities. Also, the involvement of females as pedophiles is underreported. In fact, I don't think we have any idea how many there are, but the same situation applies to them, that they're in a position of having legitimate contact with a child.
Do you think that these people are intentionally putting themselves in position of power with children?
Quite often that is the case. Whether somebody is a coach or a Boy Scout leader, they tend to have a legitimate contact with potential victims.
So the idea of a stranger in a van with candy is probably not as common as one may experience.
Oh, that's correct. I mean, it still happens, but it's extremely rare that you have a stranger who leaps out of the bushes and grabs a child and sexually assaults them. Of course, that happens, but it is extremely rare.
Connected to actual victimization and offenses, there's the whole child pornography market. Did you have much experience in prosecuting crimes related to that?
Yes, I did. In fact, initially, back in the 80s and 90s, prior to the use of computers, people who had child pornography, quite often we learned about them through someone who's developing the film, that they would see all these pictures and then contact the police. And the market then was not what it is today. With the proliferation of the internet and computers, it has just exploded.
Yeah, I see more and more cases in the news and in social media. It's become quite popular now for independent, private citizen groups to pretend to be young girls, young boys in chat rooms and lure these predators into a position where they can bring the police in.
Really, that's absolutely true. And it's become more difficult for the police. You can, hide your identity. You can, connect with people who are also involved, so they have a risk as much as the pedophile does of getting caught. And so it has become much more difficult to investigate, and it has really inflated the amount of child pornography that is available.
I remember seeing an interview with the host of To Catch a Predator, and a comment that he made that I thought was very disturbing is he said that we can go to any city in America and do this.
That's absolutely true.
That is so scary and disgusting and terrifying all at the same time.
And that's, I think, you get this emotional connection to child pornography. What's more valuable to people than their children? And quite often there's a great deal of guilt there, when they do find out, when the police come knocking on the door and say, we found all these pictures of your little boy on the internet. Failing to identify that makes them feel terrible. And quite often they will even deny that it happened because they feel so bad that they didn't notice what the symptoms were.
It's such a terrible idea that they go immediately into denial.
Yes, it is. And that's a big hurdle for law enforcement, is sometimes you have to get beyond a parent before you even begin the investigation. Because quite often you're talking about young children, they may or may not even know what happened. And if they do, it may have been pleasurable to them. They quite often not only provide sexual objects for these offenders, but they get attention from an adult, which most little kids really want.
Right. So you mentioned it can be difficult to identify this. What are signs or symptoms or things that are indicators that a child has been a victim of sexual abuse?
Usually an excessive amount of, either attention by another adult male, or sometimes it turns out to be a stepfather. You may have some physical signs like a rash that develops in their genital area, or they wind up getting a sexually transmitted disease if they're only 7 years old. And that challenges so much in us as parents that we didn't take the time that, their child was crying before, going to a Cub Scout meeting, or seemed to be very upset and didn't want to go to, an uncle's house, for example. And, parents do feel terrible when they find out the reason why.
Because they're children, and it's more difficult to, I don't want to say believe them, but effectively that's what it is, right?
Oh, yeah. Children lie. I mean, we all did as children. We don't want to get in trouble. We want mom and dad to love us. We, quite often may take a cookie and eat it before dinner. And we find out when we do that, mom gets angry. And we don't want her to get angry. So they will lie, and particularly if there's some sort of coercion or threat made against them. You tell, I'll do something bad to your mother, things like that. And so they don't tell. And quite often they don't even understand exactly what happened to them. They quite often feel that something wasn't right. But that really challenges so much in us as parents that we miss those signs.
So are behavioral changes common when children are victimized?
They very well could be. And we don't know what the circumstances are. But quite often, victims who are more likely to be victims tend also to be victims of other things, maybe abuse by a parent that interferes, I guess, quite often in the investigation.
Speaking of investigation, I mean, we just talked about how children lie, and because they are coerced to by their abuser. How is that it seems to me like that would be very prevalent, and that actually seems very almost effective in concealing the abuse.
Absolutely. To a child, what an adult tells them to do, they do. And if they did lie to mom and not tell her about being touched in their private areas, now that becomes as important as the assault itself, that they're going to feel upset that they lied to mom.
Right. Just even adding more depth to the trauma that they've undergone.
Right.
And so when it comes to investigating these crimes, how difficult, or what strategies do you take when you're trying to interview a child that might be only 6 years old?
It's extremely difficult. You kind of have to throw the interview rule book out the window, because they are totally different. I mean, you have to be able to view the world from their perspective. So you have to use terminology that they will understand. And quite often you'll be doing your interview in front of a parent, or on occasion, social service worker, nurse perhaps. So they can only tell you what they know from their perspective. And, if they see a police officer come into the room, big person, they're in a uniform, they got a gun on their hip, it can be very intimidating to a 7-year-old before they even answer one question.
Right, because they may feel that they're in trouble, or that, because they've lied, that now that's even making it more difficult, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, quite often, if they do lie to a parent will react to that firmly. And so the child doesn't really want to talk about that anymore, because they more or less got in trouble when they told the truth.
Did you find that the age of the victim made it easier to investigate as they became older?
It kind of depends on the individual. You see quite a bit in terms of those who are wealthy and those who are poor kind of have the same family life in regard to their upbringing. If dad's out of the picture and mom's working, at the drugstore to make money, mom and dad aren't there. And if you go to where, dad's a wealthy real estate broker and mom is volunteering, at the country club, there are no parents there either. The only difference is the wealthier individuals have the means to avoid going to court and going to trial. They would prefer to get someone to treat their child and not put them through a trial.
Interesting. So what I'm hearing is that there is real no differentiator between socioeconomic status. However, once you move upward in the class scale, that maybe the parents are less likely to want to pursue a criminal investigation, probably because of the awareness, the news, the attention that it will attract.
Yes, and that's a problem. Again, it really depends on the individual and the living condition. We tend to find more cases that would come from the lower socioeconomic individuals who you might be, we learned from a social service worker or from a teacher or something. So there's a tendency that many of the cases we get don't have the means. They don't have access to a therapist or treatment for their child.
So for the parents and future parents that are listening, what is some advice that you could give on how to protect your child from this kind of abuse?
Probably the most important thing is communication. In terms of a parent talking to a child is for the most part like the police would talk to a child. You have to listen to them and understand that they are relating to you something from their point of view. And, if they don't want to go see a particular babysitter or they don't want to go stay at somebody's house, there's got to be a reason for it. Now, it may be something that's totally innocent and doesn't have anything to do with sexual abuse, but a good communication with your child always helps.
Yeah, and it sounds like, just keying off what you said is that really listening to them, because they don't have the vocabulary to accurately share their reasoning for why they don't want to go over to uncle's house or whomever, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Prepubescent children, really, for the most part, they have no comprehension of sex. They may learn that, you need to keep your clothes on and they can't watch certain things on TV because they depict some kind of nudity, but they really don't have any understanding of what sexual behavior is all about, which makes it difficult for them to relay what they went through. It doesn't make any sense, and they're going to try maybe to describe it to you, but again, it's from their perspective.
And they don't have any sort of vocabulary around sexual abuse, sexuality even.
That's correct.
So maybe we've covered at this point maybe some signs. So you have physical as well as behavioral. We've talked about how to protect your kids from, maybe not protect. I don't know if there's a protect and then prepare. Maybe those are two different ideas, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's become less frequently, but the old stranger danger situation that we used to have police officers get involved in to, go to schools and talk about, don't talk to a stranger. But what if a person isn't a stranger? What if it is a coach? What if it is a teacher? What if it is a Boy Scout leader of some sort or a priest? We don't consider them strangers. So it becomes very difficult then for a child to differentiate that this person wasn't a stranger, but something bad happened to them.
Well, and as you mentioned earlier, most of the time it is someone they know and it's not a stranger at all.
Right. Absolutely correct.
Can you think of any cases in particular, and obviously we're not going to share any names or anything, that maybe you helped advance your ability to profile, investigate, and prosecute these individuals?
Well, there was one case back in the 80s, the McMartin School case, which was a preschool out in California, which I think tied in with the satanic panic, where you had, very young children staying at this daycare, and some parents begin to notice, again, like the rash, which maybe because a diaper wasn't changed quickly enough. So that kind of opened the door, and that got national attention. A male associated with a staff there had molested. First, it was just one, then several of the children. Pretty soon, it got to be every child that was there for the most part. And I may be wrong, but I think that it may still be the longest running and most expensive trial in history. And Michigan was not immune from this. We had several cases here in Michigan, and quite often the first person that reported it might be somebody at the lower socioeconomic level. And then from that, it expanded to include others. And again, we had to get across that hurdle to see, if it really happened or mom and dad trying to hide it. There's a lot of guilt that they didn't recognize some of the signs. And in the very end, the supposed offender in the McMartin case was acquitted, but he had to spend 5 years in jail prior to that. And that was wrong.
So just to pivot a little bit here, what is your experience with how these child predators are networked?
Well, of course, the internet now. Back in the 80s, it was more difficult, and so you had kind of a clandestine kind of a relationship that, I'll trade these if you trade yours. And that is the most precious item to a pedophile. It's like gold, and they will do everything they can to protect that. And, we did, back in the, I think, late 80s, I recall going to a university homecoming parade that I'd heard that there was going to be something there. It turns out that the group NAMBLA, North American Man-Boy Lovers Association, actually had a float in the parade. And people were applauding when it went by. I think they thought maybe it was a fraternity. But that's kind of how brazen it was. And shortly thereafter, I did receive a list of pedophiles who were all buying and selling the pornographic material. And that was, big at that time, but that had nothing to compare to what it is today. I mean, you can buy and sell, trade any number of times. And so there are literally thousands and thousands of pictures out there. And as you know, it doesn't go away. If we took somebody's computer and destroyed it, that doesn't do anything for those that are already out there.
Right. And I think for me, one of the most disturbing aspects about violent crime is that there does seem to be some clandestine or distribution network of child pornography, because we don't hear about a serial killers group, that has a float in the parade. And so that just is really scary to me that, they're organized and they're trying to obviously hide all of this. And the internet has significantly helped them in that respect with the internet and encryption and all this other stuff where they're able to conceal. But the fact that there are groups of people organized to share and distribute and make, right? I think that's the other thing, is that, some people are contributing to this distribution network, right?
Yes, they are. A couple things come to mind too, that we see so many guys, particularly males, who are now in their 30s or 40s, who were victimized, who did have child pornography photographs taken of themselves. And tends to be just prior to or during the time that a young boy is trying to learn how to be a man. And we know now that knowing that those photos are out there is extremely troubling and quite often can have some terrible results, that these photographs are still out there circulating.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lifetime of overcoming that, right? I mean, that's extreme. Sounds extremely difficult to get over.
It is. And, it's not even about overcoming. You never really overcome. You just have to learn to deal with it. And quite often that takes a great amount of therapy. to do that. Maybe interacting with other people who were victimized as well.
Yeah, it's so sad because, it's one thing to be a victim of abuse. It's another thing for an unknown number of people and enjoying that, right?
Right. And I have done that too, where in cases where we found a number of, maybe even hundreds of photographs of an individual, I have taken the computer and in front of the victim, we destroy everything that was on that computer. In some cases, it doesn't work, but in other cases, it does. At least we have, for the most part, eliminated these, and hopefully you can feel a little better about it, even though we know that they're probably already out there on the internet and they'll never disappear.
Well, I appreciate that you're at least trying to give them the peace of mind knowing that it was gone.
Yeah, and that's the downside, I guess, to being in law enforcement. We're not in the treatment business. And that is very difficult because, I know for a fact what may happen to somebody who is now in my office telling me about being sexually abused. But you do try to think about their well-being, and hopefully you'll be able to get through and at least help them a little bit to deal with the situation.
You mentioned earlier that many of the offenders were often victims themselves. How prevalent of a fact is that?
We don't really know. Quite often that comes up prior to a trial, that the defense attorney may bring up that their defendant was a victim themselves. And quite often we don't know. They may have been, and I'm sure that a number of them could have been victims of child sexual abuse. But that would be a whole different investigation that really law enforcement has neither the time or the reason to conduct that. If the person is now, an adult quite often. But we also hear a number of times that, pedophiles tend to be low IQ. And, I sat in a position where I've been able to review a lot of research. And a lot of it is faulty. That I'll find out that the source of the information, that somebody were antisocial or had a low IQ or were abused themselves as a child, came from interview of people who are already incarcerated. So it only applies to them. You can't really take that study and then apply it nationally. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, so it's difficult to ascertain just how many of those abusers were also abused because they're not going to bring it up unless it's in the trial as some form of defense, right?
Yeah. And again, we don't know. But there are a number of people who are abused as a child who don't become child molesters.
Right.
So you can't really say there's a causation there.
Yeah, certainly. Slight correlation, possibly.
Yeah, it may be. It may be, a matter of just getting attention. You have a lot of families that really aren't families. So if somebody, a young boy, finds that he's getting a certain amount of attention from the coach, he probably will gravitate to that. And in order to maintain that level of, closeness, they will do things that may feel a little bit wrong, but they want to maintain that closeness and that attention that they're getting.
Do you think gender has any differentiating factor with respect to that? I'm thinking like the high school football player and the high school football coach, for example, right?
It could be, yeah. I mean, most of the cases that we get involve adult males, and we know for a fact that there are adult females out there. But, when it comes to sex crimes across the board, the offenders tend to be males. And so, if you have a coach who is a high school football coach, very possibly could get involved, but usually you see a pattern. It's not a one-time situation. And so if I'm investigating that, I'm going to look at the potential of other victims and, the potential that the person reporting this was, in fact, a victim. Because there isn't a whole lot of evidence quite often.
Right. A case that was nationwide was the Larry Nasser case.
Right.
It only took one victim to come forward, and then we find, what was it, hundreds?
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunate, but it not only was something that involved a lot of, young girls, it went on for some time. And you can see, they're training, they want to go to the Olympics, they're really working hard. And here's a doctor of all people. And doctors do have the right to touch, if it's a legitimate medical procedure. But in his case, no, it wasn't. He was taking advantage of having all these young girls have to come see him for, medically related issues.
Is it fair to say that when we're talking about these pedophiles, that is the case, that it's not a one-time thing for them? It's an obsession. It's a perversion that they have this proclivity to keep doing.
Yeah, sexual behavior is unique. Even rapists, you don't see them just one time and quit forever. And it's what's referred to quite often as a paraphilia, which is kind of an abnormal sexual activity. So it can include indecent exposure, voyeurism, what's called frauderism, where an individual bumps into another for sexual pleasure. And quite often, child sexual abuse is considered to be one of those paraphilias. But the truth is, we really don't know. I mean, there's so much work that needs to be done and so much work that still needs to be assessed for us to really have a good handle on what's going on. And again, the police don't treat. So they're kind of two different spheres of professionals that rarely cross over into the other's domain.
You mentioned the kind of intentional, incidental bumping into someone and touching them inappropriately. I'm thinking that didn't even really cross my mind, is that there could be a lot of that out there, right? Where it's just kind of this very brief interaction that they, that they're getting away with probably quite a bit until they touch the wrong person, or they cross the line too far.
Yes, absolutely. And how many of those would ever be reported to the police?
Oh gosh, I don't think many at all, right? I mean,
yeah. Those cases where the victim takes action, right, result from a punch in the nose, not a call to the police.
Right. Yeah, and the scale of that, I have to imagine, is pretty significant too. It really, really, really gets my blood boiling. I'm not gonna lie. This was a difficult episode to prepare for, because it really just breaks my heart to hear that people are out there doing this all the time at a high scale.
Yeah, and one thing that I've dealt with quite often is the individual who has sexual attraction is prepubescent children, but they never act on that physically. All they do is view pornography, child pornography, which excites them and takes care of their urge. But again, those pictures involve children who are victims.
Do you feel that as they continue to get away with it, they become more brazen or increase their frequency of these activities?
That's kind of true of a lot of offenders, violators, that the more that they do, the more brazen, as you say, they get, and also the more likely that they're going to make a mistake, that police are going to be involved in the case. But they tend to get better. They learn from their mistakes. And they're now, of course, interacting with others, email, on the internet, and quite often you'll see them actually increase the number of victims.
For those offenders that you arrest, imprison, in my personal belief, maybe you can share your opinion on this, but relative to other violent crimes, the minimum sentencing is less. Is that true?
Minimum, yes, it would be, unless you can say, for example, that a child was a victim of intercourse. When you're just talking about touching, they tend not to get heavy dosage in terms of sentencing, as in the Nassar case. He had so many victims that just added up. There was really no avoiding that.
Yeah. And when these offenders get out after their sentencing, do they go back to continuing their pursuit?
Yeah, I mean, just think about sexual activity itself. If you were arrested when you got out, would you still be heterosexual? And can you change that? The only really studies that I've looked at is that you have to learn to control it, but your sexual preference is not going to change.
That's set in stone. Yeah.
It is. And what we do find, again, that there's that dividing line between puberty and body hair, basically, either prior to they don't have any or after they start to develop into an adult. We don't see that many kind of cross the line for both of them. And there's even, a class of individuals whose selected victims are infants. And that one, you don't have a victim who can tell you what happened. They are extremely difficult, particularly if it turns out to be a relative.
Right. Strangers don't have access to babies.
No, they don't. And, when it comes to reporting that to the police, there's a good possibility that they aren't. If it's an uncle or an older brother, maybe. And something that I have told particularly young mothers is don't have a teenage boy as a babysitter. Now, the child or the kid could be excellent, and there's absolutely no possibility that they would, but they are developing sexually themselves. They're beginning to try to understand what sex is all about, and having them babysit, not often, but on rare occasion, it does basically arouse their interest. And, they're in total control of a young child.
Right. And speaking of total control of a child, can you speak a little bit about where the abuser was one or both of the parents, and how you approach those cases, or even how does it even get reported? I mean, if it's the parents that are doing the abuse themselves.
That is extremely rare that you would have both parents. Now, if you have somebody who, say, is the father, that he might involve the mother to assist him in his sexual activity, that occurs on occasion, but even that is extremely rare.
How about just the father?
Well, quite often they tend to be a dominant personality, and you'll see the control over the mother as well as the potential victim. But you'd need to be looking for other indications of control, perhaps domestic assaults on the wife, an attraction to a certain different type of woman in terms of her personalities. Your father, and even more often a stepfather, but I'm not certain that a stepfather is overrepresented. I think that fathers are probably underrepresented.
Right. That was going to be my next question. So yeah, stepfathers, maybe the mother's boyfriend, the paternal father. Was that rare?
The paternal father?
Well, yeah. Paternal. Let's talk about all three, because when we talk about uncles and grandparents or cousins or whomever, those are outside of the nuclear family, so to speak, or at least they're inside the home on a regular basis, right?
Right.
What was the if you could maybe just break down the frequency or your experience with stepfather, father of the mother.
Okay, yeah. In terms of the crimes that are reported, they tend to be boyfriend and then stepfather, and the least amount would be the natural father. But it isn't likely that if it's a boyfriend or a stepfather, that the mother doesn't know what's going on, but she may be intimidated herself to report it.
But okay, I see what you're saying. Well, one thing I wanted to end this episode on, we're at about 45 minutes here, and is talking about the sex offender registration in Michigan, which you were responsible for implementing. You want to talk a little bit about that and how the success of that? I know from personal experience that it was a big and difficult project for you, but I would like to hear just about the maybe impact that has had for helping prevent future abuse.
Right. As a result of the sex offender registration nationwide, Michigan was required to develop a program for the state. And my unit was the one responsible to handle that implementation. And it was a lot of work. We had, I think, 25,000 individuals who needed to be entered in this system, and it all had to be done by hand. And after we got it up and running, for the most part, just kind of doing, our checks and balances, the FBI changed their requirements, so we had to go back and basically edit all 25,000 of those cases. And initially, it got a lot of attention. And as we were putting it in and developing the program, we want to make sure that it could be accessed by a large number of people anytime. And the thought was that, a parent could be better protected. The children could be better protected if they knew who might be an offender because of somebody who's registered in their neighborhood. That has kind of dropped off over the years. I don't hear too much about it anymore. It's still maintained, but there weren't that many individuals who were checked against that file. That has been kind of decreasing over the years, but it's still out there. And, I would recommend to all parents that they do check that and see who might be, in their neighborhood or in their community that they may want to look out for, particularly if they find out that somebody's a coach or a Boy Scout leader or something along that line.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that has fallen out of kind of the mainstream awareness. We don't talk about it. We don't think about it maybe. But I think you're right. I think that, if you move to a new place or you haven't, I think everyone who's listening should take a look at that. Now, it doesn't mean that you need to burn their house down, but having that awareness, I think, is probably a pretty critical tool, keeping your kids safe.
It is. It's one of those tools that you can keep in your toolbox that we know for a fact that if a child is going to be molested, it's likely somebody who has legitimate access to them. But it's good to know that your next door neighbor or somebody down the block had been, convicted of a sex crime. That's good knowledge to have, just to be better prepared and protect your children.
Yeah. And out of those 25,000, when you were looking at the data and you were inputting it into the system, were you able to see the age of the victim, or is the crime classified differently if children are involved?
Well, if somebody is not an adult, absolutely. So the cases that are in the file tend to be those who are adults.
The abusers are the adults, but I'm curious if you can, when you log on, can you see that they victimized a child versus an adult?
That's a little more difficult. Yeah, I think you can. if you look at the file. But, as we know, if it's the coach, we may only know that they were convicted of sexually motivated crime, level 4. We have 4 classifications in Michigan. 1 and 3 involve penetration. 2 and 4 involve touch. So you would know that they were convicted of a certain crime. You just don't know all the specifics. And again, it's just something that a parent should do, just to have an understanding, just to know that the person who is your young child's basketball coach isn't on that line in that sex motivated crime file.
Right. So really, it doesn't matter what age range necessarily that they even victimize, just knowing that that person has victimized.
Yeah, it is difficult quite often. You can have for example, a 14, 15-year-old girl who has developed to the point where she looks much older. And now she meets a guy and he thinks he's dating an 18-year-old and, has sex with her. Come to find out that, no, she's only 14. Those things I think are important in terms of investigation. But again, it becomes kind of a gray area, to be honest with you.
Right. Well, for the audience that's listening, I recommend that when you do go on your local sex offender registration website and look up your area, don't do it before you go to bed, because you're not going to be able to sleep well that night. Because I did it for my area and it was baffling. It's like looking at a Starbucks map.
Yeah, good comparison.
Well, we're almost at an hour. Is there any other ideas or advice that you can share with our audience before we wrap this up?
Again, you have to listen to your child. If they are talking about something that makes them feel uncomfortable, look into that. More often than not, you'll be able to explain, why your 4-year-old daughter has a rash in her private area. But, you have to listen to your kids. They will tell you what happened, and they can only do it depending upon their age and level of understanding of what went on.
Right. Well, that will conclude this episode of In Pursuit of Darkness. Thank you for joining us once again, Dad.
My pleasure.